Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another easy PvE build guide. Today's guide is an update on Condition Renegade. Condition Renegade is one of my all-time favorite builds. It's a beast in open world, very versatile and does great damage in group content even with a simplified rotation. My iteration uses Song of the Mists instead of Charged Mists, which removes the requirement for timely legend swaps at the cost of a small amount of damage. As always, I'll start with the DPS build and then adjust stats step by step for a more suitable gameplay for open world. Let's begin with a very brief introduction to Renegade and then go into the DPS rotation. Renegades gain access to Citadel orders and the unique buff Color's Fervor. This boosts all damage you do and is very easy to stack up via two traits, Ambush Commander and Blood Fury. The three Citadel order skills are Heroic Command, Citadel Bombardment and Orders from Above. Heroic Command is a cheap way to supply might to allies around you, which is helpful if you see that you are lacking stacks in group content. Citadel Bombardment does a lot of damage, but it's generally too expensive when you're not using Charged Mists. Orders from Above can be used to supply Alacrity even if you're not playing a boon DPS build. If you have to use it in a group, you need to skip skills in the rotation amounting to 20 energy. Now, as is standard for Condition Renegade, we'll be using the Legendary Demon stance and the Legendary Renegade stance as they provide the highest combination of damage for a condition-focused build. Let's begin with the rotation concept. The rotation itself involves swapping between Legendary Demon stance and Renegade stance on cooldown. We're pairing Shortbow with Renegade stance and Mace and Axe with Demon stance to align the melee weapon with melee and ranged with ranged. This differs from the usual benchmark rotation and is another convenience of this one. The benefit of this is that if you cannot be in melee range for a time, simply stay in Renegade stance and Shortbow for the time frame and restart the loop once you can go back into melee. Now let's talk about the new enhancement effect on Renegade stance. When using a Renegade stance ability, the next Renegade stance ability within a 4-second window will be enhanced and have its cast time removed. That way you can use it during other skills. We're using this mechanic to enhance Razor Claw's Rage to apply additional torment with it. To enhance it, we'll be using Ice Razor's Ire shortly before it. The opener of the rotation generally is very simple. You start on Shortbow and Legendary Renegade stance. Then you use Ice Razor's Ire to gain the enhancement buff for the next Renegade stance ability. Then use Razor Claw's Rage with the instant cast time. You will have some spare energy, use 7 shots or Shortbow 3 to use it. After that, swap to Malix. After swapping to Malix, you always want to activate the elite skill Embrace the Darkness and swap to Mace and Axe right after that happened. From there onwards, Embrace the Darkness will slowly drain your energy, so you have a limited amount of skills you can use until you run out. For that reason, you want to use only the following skills: Searing Fissure 3 times, Echoing Eruption 2 times and Temporal Rift once. As soon as the Renegade stance becomes available, swap to it. After swapping to that, activate Ice Razor's Ire and swap to Shortbow right after. Then use Razor Claw's Rage within the enhancement window of Ice Razor's Ire. Additionally, you want to use the following skills: Spirit Crush twice, 7-shot twice and Bloodbane Path thrice. Ideally, you'd use 7-shot after Spirit Crush to benefit from the projectile finishes in the fire field for additional burning. You have enough time to use the 3 Shortbow skills once before the enhancement window for Razor Claw's Rage expires. So usually I go Ice Razor, the 3 Shortbow skills and then Razor Claw's Rage once it becomes available. Then once the Legendary Demon stance becomes available, swap to it and repeat from there. For encounters with Defiance bars you have a bunch of CC skills. The first and strongest option is Dark Razor's Daring. This applies a whopping 600 CC damage at once and in full AoE, which is among the strongest CC skills in the game. X5 Temporal Rift is part of the rotation anyway. Shortbow 5 is quite cheap, so you can use that too. I wouldn't recommend using Call to Anguish in Malix because it's just too expensive for what it does. Now let's look at gear. Since the vast majority of damage comes from bleeding and torment, it is usually important to reach 100% condition duration on those. We violate that rule here, as Superior Rune of the Trapper is the best overall choice, despite Superior Rune of the Nightmare having longer condition duration. The sigil placements here in the build are chosen so that 2 ranged sigils are on the ranged weapon and the melee sigil is on the melee weapon. As for the choice of these sigils, it's important to know that sigils that trigger on weapon swapping also trigger on swapping legends, so they trigger twice as often on revenants. As for stats in the hero panel, you should be reaching 62% condition duration there. The traits Yearning, Empowerment and Pact of Pain provide 25% on top that isn't directly visible. In order to get there, we'll be using full Viper gear, Trapper runes and the standard Ascended damage food. The standard utility item is the Tuning Icicle, but you can also use a Writ of Masterful Malice for a little boost to condition damage. As for the relic, we'll be using Relic of the Fractal because it's simply the highest damage. In terms of traits, we'll be using Corruption, Invocation and Renegade. Generally, there are a bunch of traits that give you benefits whenever you swap legends, like Invoke Torment in Corruption. That's why it's important to swap legends on cooldown. All but one of these traits are standard for Renegade. In Invocation, we're using Song of the Mists. This applies Torment or Bleeding upon swapping legends through Call of the Demon and Call of the Renegade, similar to Invoke Torment. The benchmark rotation uses Charged Mists for more energy, but that increases the complexity of the rotation. In order to gain the bonus energy, you need to swap legends with less than 10 energy remaining. This isn't always easy to execute, and if you fail, it doesn't give you anything. The DPS gain from doing that isn't that large anyway, so you have to decide for yourself whether it's worth it for you. Let's move on to the open world build. For open world, it can make sense to make a build more forgiving so that it can sustain on your own. Luckily, Renegade allows you to do that with fairly cheap gear changes and a few trait swaps. Now, in terms of gameplay, the first major step to increase survivability is to stay on shortbow. All of the abilities in Renegade stance are ranged, so you can do that very easily. When you swap to the Demon stance, you can stay at a decent amount of range so long as the circle from Embrace the Darkness, so the elite skill, hits the enemy. That strategy allows you to deal great damage from range, so you can kite dangerous enemies instead of face tanking their damage. In terms of trait changes, use Fiendish Tenacity, All for One, Cleansing Channel and Rapid Flow. Fiendish Tenacity gives you a nice steady heal over time while you have resistance on you. If you swap legends on cooldown, you will maintain a good uptime on it. Resistance is a very strong boon, allowing you to fully ignore Blind, Chilled, Weakness, Slow, Fear, Taunt, Vulnerability, Crippled and Immobile on you. And here's where the enhancement effect comes in again. To increase the uptime on resistance, we'll enhance Dark Razor's Daring by using Ice Razor's Ire right before it. That applies 600 CC, gives resistance to you, applies vulnerability to the enemy, and as if that weren't enough, it also applies Torment and Immobilized. The trait Rapid Flow might seem gimmicky at first, but it provides a persistent steady heal and covers Swiftness in combat. Swiftness is quite big for moving out of bad stuff. If you want additional flexible defense, use Survivability Food and utility items for another minus 10% damage taken and up to 220 toughness. In addition to those trait changes, you can change your gear to make the build more forgiving and self-sustainable. My focus here lies on cheap and versatile choices instead of full survivability. Fortunately, there's also a very cheap Celestial Shortbow on the trading post, which is called Stardust. This brings additional survivability in and allows you to put more defensive sigils on it too. More on that later. On top of the shortbow, if you want easier boom coverage and or higher survivability, you can replace pieces of Vipers with Ritualists or Celestial. Ritualists, armor and trinkets are fairly cheap to buy on the trading post. This gear set also allows you to play Alacrity Renegade in group content, which is a nice synergy. The build footage that you can see in the background uses a full set of Ritualist gear. If you want to mix in Celestial pieces, I'd suggest focusing on the larger pieces first, which give you a higher bang for your buck. The amulet, the chest piece and weapons make up for over 46% of your gear stats. Let's move on to boon coverage, which is very important for solo gameplay. In order to facilitate boon coverage, I often use a Superior Sigil of Concentration, a Relic of the Herald and a Toxic Maintenance Oil. They're not required, but can also help sharing Alacrity in case you need to. In terms of might, you can use Vindication instead of Lasting Legacy to fully cover 25 stacks of might on yourself. It saves energy compared to Lasting Legacy as it allows you to cover might on yourself passively. The traits Endless Enmity and Invoker's Rage maintain Fury easily as long as you keep swapping legends. If you play group content in open world, I recommend swapping to Righteous Rebel. That allows you to maintain Alacrity on yourself and allies around you, which is a benefit for everyone. Now in terms of defensive boons, this build maintains both Protection and Vigor. Protection is covered by All for One, which applies it every time in an area when you use a legendary Renegade ability. This costs a little bit of damage since you can't use Heartseeker, but it drastically increases survivability. Vigor is maintained alongside with Fury via the trait Brutal Momentum. Even though you do maintain a bunch of boons, this build does not maintain Quickness on itself. If you want Quickness, there's two easy ways to get it. The first is using Jade Protocols. These give 150 additional toughness, vitality, condition damage and power, as well as all boons aside from stability, resistance and resolution on entering combat. These effects can be pre-stacked by using an enchanted Snow Diamond Tonic repeatedly when out of combat. They will fully cover Quickness and also Alacrity and general roaming while you enter and exit combat frequently. The quickness from this is very impactful. In case you don't want the hassle of reapplying Jade protocols from time to time, you can abuse the synergy between the relic of the Cavalier and the blast skill from the Sky Scale to apply lots of Aegis, resistance, might and quickness to yourself. It has an internal cooldown of 1 second and thus applies the boons on every hit of blast. This gives you a good head start on those boons, especially resistance and quickness are important here. In the final part of the build, let's talk about dealing with incoming conditions and control effects. Now, if you use Invocation, the trait Cleansing Channel removes a condition whenever you swap legends. For particularly condition heavy fights, you can put a superior sigil of Generosity or Purity on the Stardust shortbow. Either of the two sigils cleanses conditions in frequent intervals, and you can just swap to the weapon when you encounter condition heavy enemies. When it comes to stun breaks, you only have two options. Darkrazor's Daring is a stun break and grants brief stability. However, we're using this offensively. Now, but if you feel insecure about a particular encounter, you can also save this for the stun break. The other stun break you have available is Pain Absorption, but that is rather expensive. Don't use this unless it's absolutely necessary. The changes I suggested here are absolutely sufficient for 99% of open world content. If for whatever reason you feel the need to solo basically anything in the game with ease, you can swap out Invocation for Salvation. Additionally, you can swap to the trait Demonic Resistance in Corruption. This gives you a permanent inflow of Barrier, 2 very strong incoming damage mods, and both healing and a condition cleanse on dodging via eluding nullification. Just note that this does cost a larger chunk of your damage, as it costs uptime on Fury and other damage sources from Invocation. Now that's it for this video. You should now have an idea on how Condition Renegade can be played in both open world and instance content. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. See you next time and happy unleashing the demon.